Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. As Israel intensifies its operations on the ground in Gaza, we're still left grappling with the critical question: what happens when the guns finally fall silent, or will they never? Who will take over the reins of military control, of civil control over the Gaza Strip? Is it the Palestinian Authority? Is it some other pan-Arab force? Is it a multinational force? Or is it just going to be the IDF, as some ministers in the Israeli government want to see happen? Today, we're diving deep into these urgent questions with Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz. Lieutenant General Schwartz has had a distinguished career as a Green Beret who served in 6 combat tours across the Middle East and South Central Asia. He capped his career in his final role as the United States Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It's basically a job which is meant to, on the one hand, improve and give the capabilities to the Palestinian Authority security forces so they can enforce the rule of law in the territories where they are located and control, but also to coordinate between Israel and the PA on those issues of how can the Palestinian Authority one day get that independent capability. His experience leading Special Operations Forces in JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, and navigating complex regional politics positions General Schwartz uniquely to offer insight into these daunting challenges and maybe, just maybe, possible paths forward when it comes to Gaza and the day after. Let's get started. So, General Mark Schwartz, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really
It's great to
appreciate it.
be with you. Thank you.
So, we're talking because obviously, as the Gaza war expands and Israel now on the verge of what seems to be maybe a reenactment of what we saw about 18 months ago in the aftermath of October 7th, when Israel flooded the Gaza Strip with troops, mostly then at the north, eventually moving down to the central Gaza and winding up in the south. Now Israel's operating mostly in the Rafah area, but calling up tens of thousands of reservists, some for 5 month stints already, being told that they're going to be in from May to October. But we come back always to the same question: what happens now? Why will now be different? And what will now lead to that will potentially be different than what was before? And I thought that there's probably not a lot of people who would have the insight that you have as somebody who served as the United States Security Coordinator of the Israel Palestinian Authority and Palestinian Authority. So it's a bit of a long title there, but probably has some great acronym knowing the U.S. military. But I feel like one of the big issues that Israel's dealing with is obviously this day after plan and what things are going to look like. So maybe before we even get into your assessment of what should that day after plan look like, what role can the Palestinian Authority, which you know well and their capabilities from your previous role here, how do you see this new expansion potential escalation?
Mhm. Well, I think that what is new for this next offensive that, by all indications, the Israeli Defense Forces and intelligence services are preparing for is, there's since 7 October, just the level of understanding and the level of experience that exists inside the IDF in this type of combat that historically never has. They've never been engaged in a conflict of this duration, this magnitude, and certainly against Hamas to this extent. Secondly, what's new is Israel has very successfully decapitated the leadership of Hamas at echelon, so all the way down to the most junior tactical leadership, what we would equivalent, in conventional terms as company or battalion commanders. So that's very positive. Thirdly, I would say the understanding of the physical terrain where they're going to fight, although it's going to be very difficult. I don't want to underestimate that. But they certainly have a very good understanding, and the intelligence that they've gathered since the outset of the conflict would be the fourth thing that I would say. What hasn't changed, and what, as a military professional, I would be concerned about, if you contrast what the IDF are getting ready to do with this second major offensive in Gaza with respect to what we did, the U.S. led coalitions in Afghanistan and Iraq is we were concurrently building up a indigenous security force. That has not happened, and to my knowledge, there is no plan for that as this second offensive takes place. So there's no security entity that is being formulated to backfill eventually Israeli security forces, as they continue to go in and clear and the terrain across Gaza of Hamas. And so that is going to, what that means to me is that the potential for a longer duration operation, and I'm talking many months versus just, an 8 to 12 week offensive that they may be planning for, there's got to be an alternative security solution to, the IDF being on the ground if they want stability to occur for the national security of the Israeli people, as well as for the Palestinians that live inside of Gaza.
So let me understand something, because you talked about security alternative. So what I've often been thinking about is a new governing entity, but these are two separate things. There's
No,
governance
they're
and there's
mutually
security.
supporting. Yeah, they're mutually, sorry to step on you. They're mutually supporting. I mean, you certainly have to have an alternative governance to Hamas. And I certainly respect, the Israeli government's position that Hamas can in no way in the future be responsible for either governance of Gaza or the security of Gaza. But neither of those two entities, the governance or security, have been developed, outside of Gaza or even individuals specifically identified, to my knowledge. Now, there may be some work being done. I know the United States Security Coordinator works very closely with the Plans and Policy Division of the Israeli Defense Forces, and I'm sure some alternatives have been discussed. But I haven't seen anything from a transparent standpoint in terms of what the plan is for governance of Gaza and the security that is paramount for the governance to take hold, certainly. So that security has got to come before governance, and you can't do either one of those, from Ramallah. It's not feasible. And there's certainly many, within the Israeli government that are opposed to the Palestinian Authority assuming responsibility. In my view, in my experience, I think the Palestinian Authority, to some degree, has got to take responsibility for Gaza eventually. And the Palestinian Security Forces, while not equipped, trained, or experienced in the level of violence that they would face if going into Gaza to try to, take over security responsibility as the IDF retrogrades out post the second forthcoming offensive, they could be. And I know that there have been many attempts, even under my tenure there, to try to provide more modern equipment and to provide more modern training, enabled by the United States, but candidly supported by the Kingdom of Jordan, who have been the best partner in the region for both Israel and the Palestinian Authority in terms of building security capability and capacity.
So I want to talk. I do want to drill down a bit more on that, but I want to go back in time for a moment. You spent little over around 2 years or so in
Yes.
Jerusalem, here where I am right now, working as the United States Security Coordinator. So you became very familiar, obviously, I think, with Israel, but with the region, the Palestinian Authority, of course. And you spent a lot of time in your other positions, obviously, here in Iraq, Afghanistan, and JSOC, and Special Operations Command. But I am curious. I want to take you back to October 7th for a moment. No longer in your job, retired as a lieutenant general. But how surprised, the U is IDF well. How
Mhm.
surprised were you when you saw what had unfolded and what had happened?
I think, like any senior military professional that's worked with the Israeli Defense Forces, I was very surprised, and mainly because I gained a very strong appreciation for the level of intelligence understanding of the threats that face the state of Israel. So I was surprised that at the complexity of the offensive that took place by the Hamas, and from what I understand, just almost a bit of complacency in terms of some of the intelligence indications and warnings that have come out, in the press subsequent to October 7th, that apparently were not adhered to and taken as seriously as those that were reporting it were taking the indications and warnings. So I was extremely surprised at what occurred on October 7th.
Now, I mean, so, what that does to an extent, that type of trauma that it causes to a nation, and we kind of heard the prime minister say this the other day, which I don't necessarily personally, at least, agree with the statement of we're not going to change one organization bent on our destruction with another organization bent on our destruction. He was referring to switching Hamas with the Palestinian Authority. I don't think that's necessarily fair to call the Palestinian Authority an organization bent on Israel's destruction, but there is a lot of skepticism in Israel about what the Palestinian Authority can even do. And, I personally, as a reporter, remember the summer of 2007 when Fatah and the Palestinian Authority were basically expelled from the Gaza Strip by Hamas, never really to return since then. There were all these attempts over the years to get them back to the border crossings, but nothing ever really worked. So when Israelis do think about this, who can replace Hamas as the governing entity, or as you referred to, General, this security force? I mean, are the Palestinian Authority even a relevant player in this field?
Well, I think they have to be. I agree that they don't have the capability right now based on, the training and experience and the equipping that I, was, part of and, assisted with during my time and certainly my predecessors and my successor, General Fenzel. So, but I think it's too early to say, just point blank that they don't have the capability to do so. That capability can be built. My bigger concern is, and we saw this play out, for the United States in Afghanistan. So you can provide all, the very best training and advisory work, not only by the U.S., but our coalition allies, the equipment to an indigenous, force and for a legitimate security force seen legitimate by, the government and frankly, external parties. But if they don't have the will to provide security for their own people, no external force is going to be able to instill that into the psyche and into the character, frankly, of any indigenous force. So that's my biggest concern. That frankly was my biggest lesson from Afghanistan, and I certainly had that kind of eye-opening realization back in 2015. So 6 years prior to us departing, as I began to work closer and closer with the Chief of General Staff and his senior leaders within the Afghan military. So I think that's really important. So I can fully respect the skepticism that exists because, one of my frustrations that I had when I was the security coordinator and I communicated, with President Abbas and with Prime Minister Steyer, who was serving as the Minister of Interior at that time, that look, if you want to be seen as legitimate by, your own people, by the United States, who's the largest donor nation to building security capability and capacity, and the Israelis, you cannot have the Al-Aqsa, brigades standing, shoulder to shoulder with civil leadership, in Jenin and Nablus, even in Bethlehem. I witnessed that myself. So, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, well, that's just how we are culturally, as the Palestinian people. It's like, look, if you want to be viewed as legitimate and you're going to take, the security of your own people seriously, and you want the international community to take you serious, then your actions have got to have to demonstrate that. So I know that's a broader response than what you asked, but I think that's also important. And so, believe me, I had very very high level of frustration and several moments of them during my tenure there with that specific issue. So, but I also saw, which I would remind not only the Palestinian leadership, but also when I would interact with the IDF Central Command, that look, there are a lot of young men that want to be seen as legitimate, that want to provide security for, their own people in the West Bank, and they need to be given the opportunity and the capability to do so. And trust is through actions, and I did genuinely believe that they wanted to do that. Now, the degree by which they could take over security responsibility without a significant investment, advisory investment, and equipping investment by the U.S. broader coalition, and I think very importantly, the Gulf states, the Kingdom of Jordan, and Egypt is absolutely essential. And there's going to have to be some combined efforts inside of Gaza. Combined, I wouldn't recommend that the U.S. takes on that responsibility personally. I think that the Kingdom of Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf states really should take on that responsibility. And I believe some have communicated that they are willing to do that. But it can't be done, outsourced. You can't outsource local security responsibility, local governance to certainly, the Europeans and the United States. In my view, it's got to come from the region, and ultimately, it's going to have to be the Palestinians if they're going to remain in Gaza.
So, I think a lot of people probably listening to this don't necessarily know what the United States Security Coordinator is here. Can you give us a bit of what is this exact role? What was the mandate? What was the mission? What does it continue to be today?
Yes. So thank you. Yeah. So the mission, started in '05, and the intent was to take the many militias that were underneath the Palestinian, the PLO, and ultimately the Palestinian Authority, and form them into a viable and capable and legitimate internal security force. And internal being inside of Gaza, when after Israel moved out of Gaza, as well as in the West Bank. And so that mission under former President Bush is when it started, and it has continued to this day. The United States serves as the core member, but also Canada, the UK, and anywhere from, at its height, 6 other nations besides those have been partners in the coordinator mission. It started out primarily building tactical capability, and the U.S. in coordination with, obviously, all coordination with Israel. None of this was done independent of Israel. Used the training facilities inside of Jordan, and the Kingdom of Jordan have just been extremely gracious in terms of assisting, with allowing Palestinians to go to use the training facilities that were, in many cases, resourced by the United States, but still providing Jordanian trainers, also providing some of the equipment that's actually made in the Kingdom of Jordan, to include some of the up-armored vehicles that we see now that the Palestinian authorities have. And so we started out, building several battalions to serve as, local security. But we, over time, developed the police, developed the NSF, National Security Force, which is not kind of like a gendarmerie type capability, but still for internal security, civil defense, the internal military intelligence security services for the Palestinian Authority, and a number of other capabilities to include, health and services. So not just, not just security forces themselves, but and many of the leaders that were part of the initial stand up of the Palestinian Security Forces are still in the government and in security positions today. That is a challenge. And fast forward to my time there, when we arrived, security assistance was suspended during the former Trump administration. And candidly, I thought that was not such a bad thing, because when I arrived there was this, oh well, you've come at a very bad time, because we're not providing, the United States, are not providing resources, et cetera. And I said, look, I've been doing this type of work with with foreign allies and partners for a couple of decades. And I said, I never based a relationship between myself and a foreign partner on the amount of financial resourcing that the United States was given. I said, we can offer a lot that doesn't cost a dime, and you can do a whole lot more without, you know, any additional financial assistance. And again, I said, you've got to demonstrate that with what you have now, the resources you have, that you're willing to take on the responsibility for security. And so many of those things that I mentioned earlier about
Right.
not allowing, armed groups inside, doing protests and things like that inside of the West Bank, um, demonstrate that you have the will to enforce the rule of law. And so,
I mean, you just kind of saw that a few weeks ago when
yes, we have.
the
Yeah.
The Palestinian Authority in Jenin had tried to do this operation. And
Mhm.
after, I don't know how long they did it, it was a week, 2 weeks, or whatever it was, but they pretty much failed, and Israel had to go in and take care of it itself.
Mhm. Yes, and there's what is not probably well known. It's probably more known now than it was during my time there and before, that there is an extremely robust intelligence coordination between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, because the Palestinians genuinely want peace and stability in the West Bank. And um, I am first to acknowledge there's a lot of incursions that have taken place over the many decades of this this security relationship, but a lot of those operations were being done, and I would say um, coordinated between the Palestinian security leadership and the Israelis, because frankly, they didn't have the capability to go after certain individuals. They just don't. And you saw that play out in Jenin. And you don't build that capability overnight. It takes months just to train it, to be able to fight in close quarters, and to be able to survive that type of very intimate and extremely intense contact. And even with that, even the most experienced, you're gonna suffer casualties. So I'm not surprised that the operations that took place were not successful, because frankly, they don't have the advisory there right now to build the capability that they need. Number one. Number two, um, there's a cultural aspect to some of the challenges with these operations as well. And I mean that by, there's relations. I'm sure the Palestinians have an extremely good understanding of the threat environment that exists inside the West Bank. The only, the only folks that have almost as good, or just a very close second, are the Israelis. So they know who the bad actors are. They know where trouble exists and where the safe havens are inside of the West Bank specifically. And sometimes because of relationships, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, it's not, but there may be apprehensive to go after those threats, they being the Palestinian Security
Yeah.
Forces. So
Uh,
that's just the nature of that environment. But that's not an excuse for allowing that type of activity to take place.
you mentioned before incursions by Israelis, or and maybe not also allowing the young men from the Palestinian Authority Security Forces to step up and prove their capabilities. And if I were to ask the Palestinians, they would say, well, it's the occupation, it's the roadblocks, it's not giving us the ability to operate in area B and of course area C, which is totally off limits, but not being able to enforce civil control because the IDF is always there. I also know that over the years there have been efforts, and I don't know if this was in your time, but definitely before, to bring in maybe some more sophisticated armor or weaponry or vehicles. And Israel was always very cautious with that, not to give the Palestinian Authority anything that would potentially turn against itself, right? Which makes sense, that general fear, especially when we think back to what happened during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, when Palestinian security forces were actively fighting against the IDF. But I mean, what would you say to that, to those who say, well, it's the IDF, it's the Israelis who are not allowing the Palestinian Authority the opportunity to rise up and step up to the challenge?
Mhm. Well, first, I've got great respect for the IDF, and I primarily worked with um, the Central Command, and I worked with the Shin Bet that operate in the West Bank. And for both of those, the commanders and their forces, I have great respect for what they do. Certainly, the incursions into areas I mean, long-standing, it does in the eyes of both the passive, the government of the Palestinian Authority, and the people, it undermines the legitimacy of the security forces, et cetera. I mean, I believe it. I've heard it many times. But there's also cases where, and I take these, whether it's protests or just activities in general that lawlessness that occur, and as undermining to the authority of the passive of the raids, maybe not to the same degree, or the incursions, is the passive's inability or unwillingness to address those threats. Um, I had very good open communications, as does General Fensel, I'm sure, with the Israelis, and I take this all prior to October 7th. October 7th, everything has changed, and I don't think we're going to see the
Yeah.
level of security coordination for many, many more months, if not years, that existed during my tenure there, between the IDF and the Palestinian Security Forces. So it is a problem, but I would also tell you that there's a lot of settlers in the West Bank too that didn't have a lot of respect for the IDF either, and they
Right.
became a real challenge. In fact, I'll protect his, who he is. But one of the commanders I worked with said, "Look, we have many challenges with, the settlers, and the settler attacks on, during the olive harvest or what have you. And the IDF tried to address it, and the settlers were just as, violent against the IDF as they were, the acts against the Palestinians. So, it's a real challenge for them. So." You've got a military trying to do the job of an internal security force. And as you know, the makeup of, so set aside October 7th to now, but historically, you've got a predominantly conscript, very young IDF force that are doing 2 or 3 year tours, and their combat deployments are inside of the West Bank. I mean, that's how it's viewed, and that's the level of train up that, the IDF go through. And they might do one, maybe two rotations during their tenure, but then you're doing, you're reliving that train up and that experience, just given the nature of the conscript force, within the IDF. So that makes for a lot of challenges as well. And those aren't excuses. That's just the reality of how of how you operate. But um, my frustration, in terms of area B, and certainly area C, that's completely under governance and security of the IDF and the state of Israel. But one of my frustrations, to your point, is
Hmm.
very little control during that I observed there, of what was coming into the West Bank. Now, certainly at Allenby and the major international crossing, there was more scrutiny, but in terms of what's going in between, coming across the green line from Israel into the West Bank, not a whole lot of, I would just say, scrutiny and concern of what was going in, but coming out, there certainly was. And
Right.
so, I was always shocked at, particularly in my early days, when I would see the type of weapons that were being confiscated and whatnot. I'm like, I know there's no modern M4 rifle manufacturing capability inside of the West Bank, right? Or some of the other.
So they're getting it from somewhere, though.
They're
Right.
getting it from somewhere. And I talked with the IDF leadership and the MOD leadership about this on the occasions that I got to meet with them, and I'm just like, look, that's an area that a level of coordination and cooperation could occur to make sure that illicit, not only weapons and things like that were coming in, but also illicit goods and services that were avoiding the tax structure that frankly fed the coffers and the economy of the Palestinian Authority. So there's a host of issues, and as you know, the term, it's very complex, but I genuinely believed, and I still do, that there are incremental steps that can take that can continue to build capability and competency, and ultimately that will result in legitimacy of the Palestinian Security Forces. There are steps that can be taken to uh, really enable and then ultimately relieve some of the security responsibility that falls on the IDF in the West Bank. But all those little, incremental steps of trust, need to occur, and there has to be a willingness to cooperate, on both sides. And I think until we see the cessation of the bigger problem, and a solution inside of Gaza, that the West Bank is going to take a back seat as far as that goes. And one
So
other thing I wanted to
yeah.
say, and sorry, is that so what is really frankly impressed me, and violence is all relative, but that despite all this turmoil, all the threats, all the things that have been going on since October 7th and before, the one thing I would say is the Palestinian Authority leadership is committed to non-violence in terms of achieving their strategic objectives. So, and that is pretty well held, since
Yeah.
October 7th forward too. And so I think sometimes uh, those outside of the region that aren't familiar with, the situation on the ground there, both in the West Bank and more broadly, kind of can lose sight of that. But there's still terrorist activities that are taking place, emanating out of the West Bank into Israel, et cetera. I got that, and every one of those individuals needs to be either eliminated or captured and held accountable. Certainly, but I think there is room for a level of coordination that we haven't seen really since prior to October 7th. So.
So I want to go back. I mean, something that you said definitely in the beginning is you need this security on the ground in Gaza as Israel goes through, clears out an area, needs to be able to hand over the reins to someone. Now, Palestinian Authority, we basically understand, not ready for that mission
No.
yet. Israel can help. You need the Gulf states, you need the Jordanians, you need the Egyptians. So there's a lot of players that are needed here. But you have a lot of experience. You were the deputy commander of JSOC. So you've spent time thinking a lot about insurgency and a lot about how this works. And your other point that you made about what happened with Afghanistan. I mean, you can give a lot of great weapons and a lot of great equipment, and you can train them, give them training all day, every day for years. But if they also don't have the desire and the will, and that, I don't know what it is, that resilience, that national motivation, the spirit to fight, it's not going to stick either. So, I mean, you see the Gaza situation. What would you recommend today to the Israelis as they're going through this now?
Well, I genuinely believe that our current president has the ability to um, bring the correct international force to the table. And it doesn't have to be US led. We can certainly lead in terms of, organization, and we've got a lot of experience, as do some of our closest allies and coalition partners from two major conflicts over the course of 20 years in terms of learning from the mistakes we made in the counterinsurgency campaign that includes building a security capability and local and ultimately governance across Gaza. We've got a lot of repetitions at this, working with the U.S. State Department, international aid agencies, et cetera. So I think we should take a leadership role in that respect. But so if I had the ability to influence it, I would, certainly there are nations and I looked at Jordan, and I looked at Egypt first, and there's also some of the other Arab states in the Gulf that have very capable security forces, very capable, and have the ability and the cultural understanding to train and advise along with the Palestinians, and that's who I would turn to first, and build that capability. So you got to build you have to build the organizational structure by which this is going to occur, and then you look at the security pillars of responsibility that you need to develop. And in the first few months, it's not that complicated, right? You got to make sure that we do all the proper vetting, and we've got a long history of doing that. Leahy vetting with the with the current Palestinian Security Forces that work in the West Bank. I think the security coordinator working with the IDF leadership and working with the Palestinian leadership, security force leadership, MOI, could, go through a vetting process to identify the most competent, most capable leadership that could serve as at least as an interim core for building a Palestinian security force around. Because you have to start with a level of capability and competence. Because, right now, to my knowledge, there's been no vetting going on in terms of this, 25,000 plus, Palestinian security police that were operating in Gaza, supposedly under the purview, very, very far removed from the Palestinian Authority. But I think that, that's certainly key. And then, you've got to get a commitment, both in word and also in deed of Arab forces that are willing to go in and operate alongside of the Palestinians, inside of Gaza. I just think that that's very, very critical to do. And I think we did that with some success. Certainly, working with the Jordanians in Afghanistan, working with the UAE in Afghanistan, and we certainly worked with some of the Gulf states inside of Iraq as well, to a very strong degree. But I think that sometimes we tend to underestimate the capability of some of the Arab forces that we worked with for decades in the region. But I don't. It's going to be hard, and yes, there's going to be casualties because there's no indication at all that whatever's left of the Hamas military leadership inside of Gaza, that they're going to capitulate. So, there's going to be a lot of armed conflict left to occur, and they will, fast forward to some type of core force being built up.
But this is
Palestinians
right, General. This is the moment. In other words, if the IDF is
yeah,
now expanding the operation and is going to go in and really do what the chief of staff, the new IDF chief of staff, Ayal Zamir, said the other day, destroy infrastructure above ground and below ground. And based on what we now know, contrary to what it seemed in the beginning, or maybe just half a year ago, Israel only destroyed about 30-40% of the underground, tunnel network. There's still a lot there that's left to take care of, not to mention the hostages who are still, of course, being held there, which makes it even more complex of what you do and whether, whatever operation you're running there, how it's going to put their lives at risk. But overall, this is maybe that moment that you really, you clear out, but you got to have that force ready to go in, right? It can't be you clear out, you walk away, they rebuild and reconstitute, then you got to it's just going to be repeating itself. No.
I would agree. And again, there may be, like I said, I don't have the access that I certainly had while I was there, but so there may be plans for that, ongoing. The counter proposal that the meeting that took place shortly after President Trump announced his plan, for Gaza, when all the Arab states met, they talked about Arab security forces,
Right.
but there was, it was conceptual. But I think now it's the time to, and I believe this administration can, working with, working with the Arab partners, our partners in the region, the Arab countries that have signed on to the Abraham Accord that was led by the United States. I mean, we need to take advantage of those relationships and those agreements to, ask and, ultimately support, an Arab-led effort for building security and governance inside of the Gaza Strip. And, I think that could extend into the West Bank in the future too. One of the things I worked hard with during my tenure, and I know General Fenzel has as well, is trying to get more Arab countries visible, support to the degree that the Kingdom of Jordan and the Jordanian armed forces and police forces were providing the MOI, providing both the MOI and the Palestinian Security Forces, because the capability and competence is there. We just need to,
Yeah.
we need them to commit and demonstrate that they care as much about the future of, the security for the Palestinian people, as what, some of the historic, countries, Kingdom of Jordan and others have. So it takes boots on the ground, and it's not just financial support. It takes genuine, the greatest way to build a relationship right with any partner is demonstrate that you're willing to take the same risks and undertake the same burdens that your partner is working with. And I think, historically, the United States has done an exceptional job of that. I'm a little bit biased as a Green Beret, but I think that was one of my biggest lessons early on of working alongside, Afghans in combat. So yeah, I think that needs to extend to this current conflict as well.
Well, Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz, I really want to thank you for joining us, and your insights are extremely important, definitely at this moment, I feel, in time of where Israel is on the verge of expanding this war and what comes next, because it can't just be that you need the other leg to it, and you helped us understand it. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. I've got great admiration for the Israeli people, and also, for the Palestinians that are caught in the middle of this conflict. And ideally, I think, the U.S. and the other allies and partners in the region will do all they can, continue to do all they can to see a cessation of hostilities and ultimately bring peace to the region.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode. You can find us where podcasts can always be found: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and of course the website of Times of Israel. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with another episode